Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the Round 1 topic for Grade 12 for 2025, and that topic is that we prefer a focus on societal factors, for example, socioeconomic factors, as opposed to individual factors, for example, gender or personal history, when addressing the causes and consequences of mental health issues. In this session, we're going to cover a few things as you've seen in these videos in previous years, largely pretty similar. We're going to start by looking at the debate context overview. Um, this is things that I think are worth researching. Um, Next, we're going to look at preferred debates and how to specifically handle those, and how that sort of interacts with setup. And then a few tips I have for sort of like thinking about points. I won't go into depth for like how to structure your points or how to structure rebuttal in this video, because I think that most people in year 12 have a bit of a history with this. You probably have a decent idea of how you feel comfortable going about that. And so I think it's more useful to cover the stuff that's more in the realm of like preferred debates, which is probably a bit more foreign. And also just some tips for what this debate is really about, because it can be a bit difficult to find the clashes in this debate, I think. So I think that's a bit more useful. But if there's anything that I don't particularly cover, for example, the sort of like more transferable stuff about structuring points or rebuttal or POIs, hopefully that's covered in previous videos, either for other grades from this year or year 12 videos from previous years. So feel free to have a look at probably the second half of other videos, and you'll probably find that kind of stuff. Let's start with looking at the context though, which, as always, is the things that I think it's worth doing a bit of research about beforehand. The first thing that I think you should do in this debate is you should get a list of things that are examples of mental health issues. This debate has the ability, I think, to become a, a I don't know if insensitive is the word, but I think it can become a bit blasé if everyone only ever uses one example, especially if people only ever use one extreme example. I think that it's useful to have a list of potential things that could be issues, um, especially because I think that there are probably different ways that different ones of them interact with the topic. I don't have a lot of spec knowledge about this, so I'm not going to be great at giving you examples here. But I think it's believable that the way that the points in this debate will work might vary a bit depending on which kinds of mental health problems we're talking about. So it might be useful to have a bit of a list here. The next thing is just you should do a bit of research about what things do affect mental health, what societal factors or individual factors do. The important thing here is that this debate is not like a factual debate about what are the biggest effects. It's a question of what is it more productive to focus on. And so this isn't a research question that's like, oh, like solve the problem of like what is the cause of like people suffering from anxiety. It's more so if you have an understanding of what those factors are, that will then be useful when you start to turn that into your more practical points about is it like how do we address them? Because it will vary. Part of this debate is possibly in the direction of like policy concerns about trying to prevent some issues. Some things are less about trying to prevent them, but more about, well, inevitably people will suffer from this. How do we best treat them? How do we best give people the support that they need? And so you want to have a good idea about what those factors are, just so you can have an idea of how realistic it is that you can react to them or be proactive in response to them as well. The other thing I wrote down here is how do we currently train people like psychologists and psychiatrists to deal with this kind of stuff? Um, there are one of the complicated things about this topic is that it is set at multiple very different points in time and space at the same time, or more so in space. Which is to say, we deal with mental health issues very directly when people seek treatment from psychologists and psychiatrists, and having a good idea about how they currently go about dealing with it is probably going to be pretty useful for informing your idea of what current problems might be. The other thing that I didn't write on this slide, but I've realized as I'm saying this is quite useful, is you want to have a good idea of how we currently address this policy-wise. Because I think another part of this debate is how does the government think about this kind of thing? When we talk about the sort of causes and consequences, what role does policy have in terms of some quite sort of standardized things. Part of this debate is about individuals and how we individually respond to a person, but it's also about how we respond to an epidemic more broadly. The next thing to look at is setup. Usually in year 12, I will be telling you, don't define the topic. But because this isn't a policy debate, as we'll get to on the next slide, and the teams aren't going to have models, if you don't have a specific definition, you're not going to cover this kind of stuff. So I think it's worth having a list of these kinds of things. None of this will be particularly shocking in terms of understanding what words I'm going to suggest that you define. I think broadly, you're going to define what societal factors are and individual factors and what the words cause and consequence mean. The other word that I didn't put here, but it's very relevant, is who is we? Like, are we acting as like medical professionals? Are we acting as governments? Are we acting as like social workers? Are we acting as like friends and family? The answer is we're probably acting as all of them, right? But you want to have an idea that we as everyone here. So that's my hints for defining the topic. It's nothing particularly interesting. It's just I've kept this slide up for the reason that because you don't have a model, if you don't have an explicit definition, if anything becomes contentious, you will want that definition. The more useful thing to look at is preferred debates. Okay, let's start with the abilities for the teams to do things in preferred debates. You should think of a preferred debate in the same way that you would think of a regret debate, with the exception that regret debates are retrospective, meaning that historical examples are just like objectively true, compared to a preferred debate, which is more prospective. But they do have a big similarity, which is, in fact, they have two big similarities. The first thing is that we aren't modeling in what is the perfect way to do this thing. We are saying, would we prefer this thing to be the focus? In the question of, if this was the focus, how do you think people would go about focusing on individual factors? How do you think people would realistically go about focusing on societal factors? In the same way that in a regret debate, you don't get to say, oh, but like if this thing was perfect, we wouldn't regret it. You're regretting it as it does or does not exist. The other way that they're quite similar to regret debates is that there's an easy trap in this debate to only talk about whether your side is good or bad, or only talk about whether the other side is good or bad. In the same way that in a regret debate, you don't want to get caught up in just saying, we regret this thing because it's bad. You want to make sure that you're being comparative. If you can prove on affirmative that there are a lot of societal factors and it's good to focus on them, that's great. But if it's better to focus on individual factors, then it's better to focus on individual factors. So you want to make sure that you're being quite comparative. The other piece of advice I will give about preferred debates in general is you need to pick a side. What I mean by this is, firstly, negative should not argue in this debate. We want, instead of focusing on one, it to be a perfect balance. No, negative has to support the thing in the topic if there is a thing given in the topic. If the topic says we prefer social factors to individual factors, the negative burden is to prove individual factors are preferable to social factors. Also, if you just try and make it super messy and say, but we want the perfect balance and we're going to have equal focus on both, it's like, but focus is zero sum to some extent. And that means that every time that affirmative cares about, every time that negative cares about individual factors, affirmative has the ability to care about social factors. So it's unstrategic to spend a lot of time saying, but both are important, because at some point you need to pick something anyway. The additional thing here is it's often tempting in a prefer debate to take the approach of like conceding some ground and saying, well, you've pointed out an example, and that example is a reasonable time when we'd prefer your side of the topic, but usually we prefer the other side. I think you should just try and take a pretty hard stance in this kind of topic, in a preferred topic, mostly just to make the debate cleaner. The easiest way for this kind of debate to get really messy in a way that makes it very, very difficult to adjudicate is if both teams try and sort of claim a bit of the happy medium. And like affirmative is saying, well, look, there are some examples of when it's good to focus on individual stuff, but usually we'd focus on societal stuff, except affirmative only ever gives the examples of the individual stuff because that's where they're making the concession. And it's just sort of fairly assertive and vague about what the societal stuff that's important are. And the negative is doing the exact thing in the opposite direction. That just becomes quite messy, and that's bad because it means you have very little control over what the adjudicator will think. It is best for your interest as a debater, I think, to make the debate quite clean and say, yes, we are going to generally, in all cases where we need to make a decision, care about the thing that is on our side of the topic. And that means that you want to be thinking, and we'll get to this on the next slide, but to basically just in every possible context, is there a reason why it is better to focus on one thing to another thing? Hopefully that gives you a decent rundown of preferred debates. I'm not sure if the QDU has a video on the YouTube that is specifically about preferred debates to cover this in more detail, but hopefully this makes sense. Just sort of think of it in the same way that, like, it would be weird if a negative team in a regret debate said, you know, sometimes we do regret it. It's like, no, you just have to always not regret it, right? And treat this in the same way that, like, you kind of have a bit of a burden to defend it in most cases. It's not squirreling for you to say, there's some cases where the other side is correct, but I think it's just generally a bit unstrategic and makes the debate messier. The last big thing I'm going to cover is brainstorming point ideas. Now, this is a case where the stakeholders, I think, are a bit different to normal. The stakeholders in this debate aren't necessarily all of the people that are being impacted in terms of the outcome, in that pretty clearly the group that's affected and the group that this debate is about are people suffering from mental health issues. And maybe you can segment them into things that you are born with compared to things that you like gain over time. But like, I still think that it's kind of just one big group that is going to be most of the sympathetic outcomes will occur to that group. And you might be thinking, well, how do we diversify this into 3 or 4 points? Think about stakeholders more so in the realm of who is it that is capable of sort of perpetuating this preference. So, for example, how does this preference manifest in a psychiatrist's office? How is your session with a therapist different depending on what they focus on? And that will give you the ability to talk about whether it's better for you when you're talking to a mental health professional to be talking about the individual factors or the societal factors. Is it compelling for you to feel as if you're not being like there's, I don't know, less risk of victim blaming if like you're blaming the structure rather than the individual? But maybe it's harder to sort of like relate specifically to your circumstance, and it's harder to sort of gain closure. Obviously these are like point sort of jump off points, but you can explain them in a lot more depth to make them more sophisticated. Similarly, this debate is going to operate super differently if it's not taking place in the therapist's office, but if it's taking place like, I don't know, with your family and how your family interacts with you as you go through this. Or it's going to operate really differently if it's about politicians and how politicians draft policy. So think about stakeholders, I think, for the sake of this debate. Somewhat think about the outcomes. I think that's definitely relevant in terms of like, how does this narrative affect people that aren't necessarily the ones suffering? Like, how does it affect other groups of people? But when you inevitably sort of think, well, most of this debate is about how do we support people that need help, the fact that they're supported in so many different settings is, I think, another legitimate way for you to try and come up with different arguments. And so that's my advice in terms of brainstorming. Use all of the other tips that you'd usually use in terms of brainstorming. I think preferred debates can have principled arguments, although, as always, be a bit cautious. I don't think you should be running an argument that's like, the government has an obligation to provide the best mental health support, because this is uncontroversially true, but it entirely relies on you proving your practical argument, which is that you do provide the best mental health support. And so just be a bit cautious there of like not running sort of a government obligation principle that doesn't actually have merit by itself and it relies on a practical point. that's my advice about principled arguments for the sake of this debate. But yeah, that's all of my advice in terms of how to approach this kind of topic, which is a preferred debate. And I'm not sure if you've done a preferred debate before, so they might be a bit foreign. And hopefully there is something you can get out of this video that helps you clarify just sort of what this debate is about, especially in terms of broadening where you think this debate takes place. But yeah, thank you very much for watching this video. Obviously, if you're watching it, you've already found the YouTube channel. But there are other videos up here, especially given, as I flagged towards the start, there's some stuff I didn't talk about. I didn't really go into much depth, or possibly any depth, about like how to structure arguments or structure rebuttal. And I know this is because most people that debate in year 12 have debated before. And I figure that it's more useful to teach you about the new stuff in terms of preferred debates than it is to teach you about stuff that you already know. But if you are new to debating in year 12, that's awesome. Good on you joining a new activity in year 12. But you're probably looking for some of the previous videos we've got up. Especially, I think, if you're looking for advice about things like POIs, even if it's just like the year 11 video from the start of this year, that's sort of our up-to-date stuff about POIs. But also you might be able to find a specific video that is like, in fact, we do have a specific video about the rules of POIs that will be directly transferable if you've got more questions about that. But yeah, thank you very much for listening along. Hope that you learned something useful. Best of luck for your next debate. Best of luck for all of your debates in the future. Hope you're enjoying debating. Bye-bye.